All rise.
The Kosovo Specialist Chambers is now in session.
Be seated. Good morning, everyone. Madam Court Officer, please call the case.
Good morning, Your Honors. This is case KSC BC 2020-06, the Specialist Prosecutor versus Hashim Thaci, Kadri Veseli, Recep Selimi, and Jakub Krasniqi.
Thank you. I note that Mr. Thaci, Mr. Veseli, Mr. Selimi, and Mr. Krasniqi are present in the courtroom. Today we will hear the opening statements of the Krasniqi defense. I recall that the instructions and directions given on Monday continue to apply. Ms. Alejandra, the floor is yours. You have 1.5 hours.
Thank you, Your Honors. Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors, and my learned friends. A great many matters have been raised by learned counsels for the defense of Mr. Thaci, Mr. Veseli, and Mr. Selimi. I intend to confine myself and not repeat submissions that have already been made. For the court schedule, I anticipate that I will need no more than 45 minutes. And with Your Honor's leaves, some words from Mr. Jakub Krasniqi, and I ask that he be given 25 minutes, Your Honors. And lastly, if Your Honors will give me 5 minutes to conclude. Jakub Krasniqi is now 72 years of age. 25 years ago, he felt compelled to join the Kosovo Liberation Army to defend his people in relation to an onslaught that the free world, and according to my submission, all right-thinking people condemned. We must not lose sight of the fact that the regime he was fighting against was the same regime that committed mayhem, gave rise to oceans of tears, heartbreak, misery, and wide-scale destruction throughout the Balkans. This regime caused, amongst other crimes, the genocide at Srebrenica. Perhaps you can understand why a then 47-year-old Jakub Krasniqi had to put aside his hopes and dreams of a peaceful life in order to fight for the people of Kosovo and for his children and for future generations so they may live in a peaceful Kosovo. Jakub Krasniqi's role as the spokesperson of the KLA has been publicly known for 25 years, a quarter of a century, since his appointment was announced in June 1998. The statements he made in support of the KLA were made publicly. In his dealings with the media and international representatives, he used his own name. He didn't use a pseudonym. Everything that he did was public and open. 18 years ago, Mr. Krasniqi was interviewed and then called as a witness by the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICTY, by a team which included the acting specialist prosecutor, Mr. Alex Whiting. He testified in the cases of Limai in 2005 and Haradinaj in 2007. No one suggested that he was a suspect or that he was personally connected to any crimes. After his testimony, he went back to Kosovo. Mr. Krasniqi provided evidence as a witness on 2 further occasions in 2018. Again, there was no suggestion that he was a suspect or was culpable for any crime or wrongdoing in those cases, even though the underlying crimes in those cases form part of the crime base in this case. It is also worth reinforcing the fact that Mr. Krasniqi was not named in the Council of Europe report in 2011 as being suspected of any criminal liability. After more than 20 years of war crimes investigations conducted by the ICTY, and after just as many years of intense political and media scrutiny in Kosovo, Mr. Krasniqi had never been arrested for a crime. Yet, on 4th November 2020, at around 6 a.m., his house was surrounded by armed police, his home was searched in the presence of his family, and he was brought to The Hague cuffed. At 70 years old, despite his history of cooperating with international justice, he wasn't given a dignified opportunity to appear voluntarily. Your Honours, it is our submission that he deserved better. It really was a blow to Mr. Krasniqi and his family, and Your Honours, to the people of Kosovo. People were shocked and perplexed because they cannot match the allegation in this indictment with the person that they know Mr. Krasniqi to have been and that he is. I have every confidence that in the course of this trial, Your Honours will see not only how the prosecution manifestly failed in their bid to prove a case against Mr. Krasniqi beyond reasonable doubt, but you will also see how he should never have been charged at all. Your Honours, my opening will focus on 6 fundamental errors that we say are fatal to the prosecution case. These 6 are just examples of the many more errors by the prosecution Your Honours will see in the course of this trial. The first error, Your Honours, is that the prosecution misunderstands or deliberately mischaracterizes the personal role of Mr. Krasniqi. In June 1998, Mr. Krasniqi was appointed as spokesperson. He had no defined role before that time, nor was there a general staff in any meaningful sense of that word. But from June 1998, Mr. Krasniqi was the spokesperson. Your Honours, we all know very well the role of the spokesperson and its limitations. Spokespersons are not involved in military operational matters. Their role is outreach and public relations. This, Your Honours, was exactly what Mr. Krasniqi's role amounted to. Here I respectfully raise a note of caution. Your Honours, you will hear witnesses speak about the structure of the KLA, some of whom have no basis for their purported knowledge beyond gossip or uninformed speculation. You will also hear prosecution witnesses speak about Mr. Krasniqi, although they only know his name because they saw him on television or in the media or years after the end of the conflict. We are confident that Your Honours will sift the evidence and discard evidence which has no basis in actual knowledge or which is founded in conjecture. Next, I will say a few words on communiques. It cannot be inferred from his position as spokesperson that Mr. Krasniqi was personally responsible for the communiques, on which the prosecution places so much weight. The prosecution's case is that the first communique was issued in 1994. That is long before Mr. Krasniqi ever became the spokesperson. They continued throughout the war and clearly did not emanate from one source. Some, for instance, being issued by the operational zones. 2 days ago, the prosecution submitted repeatedly that certain documents were found during the search of Mr. Krasniqi's house. If these documents were so found, and the mishandling of the search and seizure is already before Your Honours, it does not automatically establish beyond reasonable doubt that he authored those documents or that he possessed those documents at the material time. Merely finding those documents in his house does not make them authentic. This is an obvious and basic point, and yet somehow it seems to have escaped the prosecution's understanding. After all, Your Honours, Mr. Krasniqi is a writer and a historian who gathers material for his research, his interests, and for his numerous books. He has gathered, been given, or collected a variety of documents over a number of years. The burden is on the prosecution to prove when these documents were written, when they came into his possession, who drafted them, and for what purpose. In mid-November 1998, as part of a broader attempt to organize, Mr. Krasniqi was appointed as one of 2 deputy commanders. The prosecution fails to acknowledge that there was a distinction between the roles of the 2 deputy commanders, one deputy commander for operations and a second deputy commander for support, fulfilled by Mr. Krasniqi. The question Your Honors will have to ask yourselves is why the prosecution is so determined to omit this detail in its indictment, in its pretrial brief. Even 2 days ago, the prosecution presented slide B44, titled GS Fall 1998 Organizational Chart, which clearly said Deputy Commander for Support. Yet, only the words Deputy Commander were read aloud. As soon as it is acknowledged that Mr. Krasniqi's role was limited to support, an administrative role, and that there was another Deputy Commander and a Chief of Staff dealing with operational matters, then the allegation that Mr. Krasniqi was a commander with effective control over fighters falls away entirely. The prosecution also fails to acknowledge that just 3 months later, there was a marked change in the composition of the General Staff in February 1999. Some of the very first witnesses chosen by the prosecution will speak to this fact. The simple truth is that after February 1999, there is no evidence that Mr. Krasniqi was a deputy commander. During the course of this trial, Your Honors will hear testimony about Mr. Krasniqi's role from a variety of witnesses, including those within the KLA who knew him only as the spokesperson throughout the relevant period, a role he performed from April 1999 for the PGOK, not the General Staff. In the summer of 1999, he was appointed as Minister of Reconstruction and Development in the PGOK, a role to which he was allocated not by the KLA, not by the PGOK, but by an entirely different party, the United Democratic Movement, known as the LBD. The prosecution evidence will show the true role of Mr. Krasniqi. He did not have the powers or responsibilities that the prosecution seeks to assign to him, nor can his public activities as spokesperson be connected to any crime the prosecution alleges. After all, during the entire 18-month indictment period, and throughout more than 40 locations, the indictment only in fact alleges that Mr. Krasniqi personally participated in any crime on 3 occasions. On all 3 occasions, all that we need say now is that the evidence will show that the prosecution has got it wrong. Your Honors, the second prosecution error is its insistence that Jakub Krasniqi was responsible for crimes that he was geographically remote from. Clear examples of these are that from the 6th of February to the 25th of February 1999, Mr. Krasniqi was outside Kosovo participating in the Rambouillet negotiations. From the 10th of March till the 19th of March 1999, he returned to Paris for the second stage of negotiations. From 19th March 1999, Mr. Krasniqi was unable to return to Kosovo, and until 15 June 1999, for that whole 3-month period, he was located in Albania, apart from a brief period when he toured Western European countries. Following the ICC's appeals judgment in Bemba, Mr. Krasniqi's physical distance from the alleged criminal acts during different points of the indictment period is particularly relevant. He was not in a hierarchical relationship with the physical perpetrators of crimes. He lacked any ability to effectively control any fighters, let alone those who were geographically remote from him and who were not in any way linked to his day-to-day work as a spokesperson. Another symptom of the unfocused nature of this case that the prosecution fails to explain is how it proposes to prove that he had the ability or the authority to prevent or punish a series of crimes alleged to be committed in a different country. The third prosecution error, Your Honours, is that it wholly overestimates the organization of the KLA. The prosecution puts forward an unsubstantiated theory that the KLA was more organized than it was. The evidence will expose this theory for what it is, a fantasy, which ignores the reality on the ground. Your Honours have heard the statements of the defense for Mr. Thaci, Mr. Vasselli, and Mr. Salimi. I will not repeat submissions, safe to say that the prosecution appears to have bought into the KLA's propaganda, unquestioningly taking documents as though they represent the true situation on the ground, when the evidence will show the opposite. The evidence will show that the organization of the KLA varied across locations, as well as over time, never reaching the standards of a formal military structure. Before I briefly sketch out the stages in the evolution of the KLA, an evolution which shows different stages of disorganization of the KLA, in which it was striving to become an organized regular military, an aspiration it never achieved, suffering setbacks in the face of Serbian offenses. Allow me, Your Honours, to highlight another glaring omission in the prosecution case. Where is the prosecution's military expert? In a case about the command structures of a non-state actor, is that not the first expertise to which the prosecution would have turned? Instead, what you have before you are hundreds, thousands of documents, and Your Honours are being asked to try to piece the puzzle together yourselves. At the beginning of the indictment period, as Your Honours heard yesterday, the KLA was really a number of disparate groups of volunteers who organized themselves in villages to defend themselves and their families. There were no upward links to any higher structure or to the general staff. Personal and family loyalties tethered KLA members together rather than codified system or rules. They chose their own leaders, and these leaders answered downwards to their fighters, not upwards to any higher structure. These groups came together when confronted with terrible human rights violations by Serbian forces. The efforts of these volunteers were directed against the military enemy, that military enemy, and not at any civilian population. Public statements from that time must be viewed in that context, as attempts to increase support for the war effort against Serbian forces and give hope and morale to the people. I dwell for a moment on the fact that these fighters were volunteers. Most did not have military experience or military training. They came from all walks of life: students, farmers, teachers, doctors, lawyers. They came from all political parties. They were not paid. They became fighters to defend the children, women, and men of Kosovo. They couldn't stand by and ignore what was happening. It is difficult to appreciate the extent of the disorganization standing here in The Hague, with the knowledge we all have of how regular militaries function. We are talking about people going on guard duty without weapons. We are talking about volunteers having to travel to Albania to source their own weapons and uniforms. We are talking about a time when even crossing main roads, which were controlled by the Serbian forces, was difficult, dangerous, and could take hours, so that journeys had to be conducted on lesser roads using indirect routes across difficult terrain. Your Honours, the prosecution evidence will show that the KLA was never able to reach the level of organization that the prosecution asserts. Your Honours have heard that attempts at organization were swept aside by the summer offensive of 1998. Volunteers laid down their arms, fled their houses, and in some cases left Kosovo. Many units were hollowed out or became ever more disjointed. Another attempt at organization began in the breathing space provided by the Holbrooke-Milosevic ceasefire agreement and included attempts in November 1998 to create what were called directorates. It is important to emphasize that it takes time to create new institutions and organizations when you are working with volunteers without experience in the middle of an armed conflict with limited resources. When attempts were being made to organize, the expectation was that the war would last years. Little did they know that it would be over within 6 months. The directorates that were named on paper in November 1998 must not be mistaken for fully functioning, organized directorates of the kind familiar from a regular army. They were a shell, often consisting of one or very small number of people, with administration or guidance to support them. The same could be said for the General Staff itself, which was never the well-functioning governing body described by the prosecution. Many witnesses within the KLA will testify that they were even unaware of all the General Staff members or their roles. The regulations relied on by the prosecution must not be taken at face value. They might look like regulations, but logically they couldn't apply to the circumstances of the KLA, and even then fall far short of the equivalents in regular armies. For instance, the very first paragraphs of the disciplinary regulations on which the prosecution relies to establish ability to punish refer to a constitution. The KLA didn't have a constitution. These regulations were aspirational and did not reflect the true position. Moreover, Your Honours will hear from a variety of KLA witnesses who had no knowledge of the written regulations or their contents at all. In spring 1999, efforts to organize were again severely damaged in the face of a wave of further Serbian offensives. The KLA was once again scattered, driven from any bases it had occupied, and was surviving on the margins in ever more difficult conditions. After June 1999, after the NATO bombing and the Serbian withdrawal, both KLA fighters and hundreds of thousands of civilians returned to Kosovo, returned to find their family members dead, their houses burned, their possessions or livelihoods taken or destroyed. Individuals in those circumstances may have looked to settle personal grievances or take revenge. The situation was chaos, quite beyond anyone's ability to control. At the same time, volunteers were leaving the KLA, returning home to look for their own relatives. K4 too lacked the capacity for policing or to prevent crimes. The evidence will show that there was never a functioning vertical chain of command. Prosecution witness after prosecution witness will come and will tell the court about the limitations of communications, the lack of reporting, and the lack of awareness of the KLA regulations on which the prosecution relies. From the beginning and throughout, the General Staff never had the ability to impose a common plan on the fighters calling themselves the Kosovo Liberation Army. Fourth, Your Honours, the prosecution has failed to heed the jurisprudence of the ICTY. Findings relevant to this case, indeed we would say decisive on many issues, have already been addressed by my learned friends. From the cases of Limai and Haradinaj, much of the evidence being presented to Your Honours is evidence that was gathered by the ICTY and relied upon in those cases. Yet, this prosecution is determined to invite Your Honours to reach conclusions different, indeed at times diametrically opposed, to those reached by the 9 trial judges who sat on the Limai and Haradinai cases. This attempt is doomed to fail. If sufficient knowledge, intent, and plan could not be proved on the part of local command, how can this prosecution hope to establish it at a general staff level, which is even further removed from the events on the ground? That is far from the only issue on which the prosecution invites this court to depart radically from the findings of the ICTY. The prosecution ignores the ICTY's conclusion that the communiques and public statements fail to establish a common criminal purpose. The exact same communiques and public statements that the prosecution relied on in its opening were before the ICTY. The prosecution ignores the ICTY's findings about crimes against humanity. In Limai, the trial chamber concluded the means and methods used by the KLA do not evince characteristics of an attack directed against a civilian population. The prosecution also ignores the ICTY findings about the start and end of the armed conflict. The prosecution must prove each of these matters beyond reasonable doubt. In reality, the prosecution is simply putting the same case again and hoping for a different conclusion. That cannot be, because the authoritative findings of the ICTY will, at the very minimum, represent reasonable alternative inference on the facts, which will prevent the prosecution of establishing its case. Fifth, Your Honours, the prosecution overlooks the significance of NATO's support to the KLA. An undeniable feature of this case is that NATO supported the KLA in Kosovo. NATO engaged with the KLA at multiple levels. Without NATO airstrikes, Serbian forces would not have been removed from Kosovo. At the same time, the prosecution alleges that there was a common criminal plan, which it said 2 days ago was not a secret. It was in the open. That would mean that NATO supported a known criminal enterprise. That cannot be right and is affirmatively wrong. Unlike NATO, Mr. Krasniqi did not have satellites, aeroplanes, intercepted communications. Look at his circumstances. He was a teacher and a historian, not a military professional. His means were limited. Since his name was known to the people and to the Serbian forces, he knew that he was a target, and for much of the indictment period, he was traveling in secret, staying with families whom he trusted. He had no means of knowing that crimes were committed in these distant locations. Sixth, the prosecution assumes that the occurrence of crimes in different locations can only be consistent with a common criminal plan. At the end of this case, the prosecution may have established that some crimes were committed in some locations in parts of Kosovo during the conflict. History has shown that conflict creates an environment in which individuals sometimes may commit crimes. Even within the most highly organized militaries, it's not entirely possible to prevent crimes. Your Honours, in recent years, there have been reports of crimes by Canadian troops in Somalia, Australian troops in Afghanistan. The list goes on. But it is another matter entirely to assert that there was an organized policy or plan behind these crimes. In this case, establishing that crimes were committed by KLA fighters or people in KLA uniforms is not enough to impute those crimes to Jakub Krasniqi. This was a volunteer army which came together trying to act as soldiers, trying to improve, trying to learn on the job. This is very far, for instance, from the United States Army, very far from a conventional army. They didn't all have uniforms, and when they did, they weren't even the same uniform. To infer an organized common purpose from the actions of dispersed and disorganized fighters in these conditions does not make sense. Finally, the fact that crimes may have occurred in diverse locations at different times does not establish the pattern alleged by the prosecution. If there was a common enterprise to commit crimes against a class of opponents, why weren't crimes committed consistently throughout the indictment period at each location? Similarly, if crimes followed some central instruction or event, the evidence should show a wave of offences in all locations following that instruction or event. Instead, the evidence discloses a series of spontaneous local responses to situations arising from time to time at a local level. Your Honours, these 6 errors are only examples illustrating how fragile the prosecution case is. More will be exposed as the evidence is called, and we are confident that at the close of the prosecution case, we will be able to make the same strong submission that we make now at the outset. There is no credible evidence connecting Jakub Krasniqi to any crime. There is no credible evidence of a common criminal purpose. There will be no grounds requiring the defense to be called at the end of the prosecution case. After Kosovo was left behind and ignored in Dayton, Kosovo Albanians had no choice but to self-organize, to protect and provide equitable human rights for citizens across the country. Kosovo Albanians had the right then, and they have the right now, to be treated equally and equitably. We are confident, Your Honours, that in this court, they will be accorded their fundamental rights. The standards we apply to them are the standards we apply to ourselves. That is why we are today fortunate that we have independent, impartial judges of significant experience who we trust to scrutinize the evidence and not to give any weight to the politics or the noise from certain quarters that more Kosovans must be convicted. Now, Your Honours, with your leave, if Mr. Jakub Krasniqi could say a few words.
Mr. Krasniqi, you have the right to make an unsworn statement, and you have the floor.
Your Honor, President of the trial, Your Honours, member of the panel, at the beginning of this trial, allow me to say a few words about my life, not to defend myself against defamation made against me in this indictment, but to shed some light on what I think is necessary to understand my complete innocence. I was born on the 1st of January 1951 in the village of Negros in Drenica. We were 8 brothers and 3 sisters. My elder sister doesn't live anymore. I am the second eldest brother. My father, Janusz Krasniqi, was an educated man, and with a little more engagement, he might have been a teacher. But he didn't agree with the regime of the time and chose to till his land and provide for his children's education. Education was always important for our family, except for my older brother, who worked abroad, and my 2 big sisters, who completed their mandatory education only. The rest of us continued our professional path of education. I was born 6 years after the terrifying January of 1945, when the communist regime armed forces committed one of the most hideous acts of genocide of that time: the murder of thousands of Albanians, the imprisonment of many others, and the programmed displacement of Albanians to Turkey. All those terrible acts took place after the Second World War ended and after many promises had been made by the Yugoslav Communist Party that it would respect the Albanian people's right to self-determination. I note that in line with the political cause embraced by the fighters of the National Liberation War, the Kosovo delegates to the Bujan conference that was held from the 31st of December 1943 till the 2nd of January 1944, endorsed a resolution enshrining the political will of their people, which was for Kosovo and the plateau of Dukajin to be united with Albania after the war. However, rather than complying with this political will, as soon as the war ended, the Yugoslav communist regime installed a military administration in Kosovo and executed thousands of Albanians without due process. The state of emergency and the military administration in Kosovo continued until July 1945, when the so-called Prison Assembly decided that Kosovo would be annexed to Serbia. I am referring to these facts as they illustrate the circumstances in which I was born and raised. I know that from a very young age I was surrounded by people who survived the genocide policy of Serbia. Their relatives were killed, wounded, or imprisoned, and their houses were destroyed and their properties confiscated. From the distressing stories my family and my childhood friends told, and from what I would later see and hear wherever I went, I came to understand that the propaganda of Yugoslavian paradise of nations' equality disguised a terrible hell which the Kosovo Albanians had to endure not only through several decades of communist regime, but through the systematic violence they faced for more than a century since the time of the creation of the Balkan states in late 19th century and early 20th century. When I was 5 or 6 in the winter of 1956-1957, with the pretext of gathering weapons from Kosovo Albanians, the Yugoslav communist regime started a new wave of the designated violence for forcing Albanians to flee their land. My father was a victim of that violence. I can still remember vividly the day when my father came home brutally beaten, my mother tending to his pain from the inhumane torture in a corner of our home. To this day, the image of my father's thrashing body is still vividly scorched on my memory. In addition to those tortures, he was constantly persecuted and lived other bigger traumas. My imprisonment, for once, was very difficult for him. My family believed that education would help us against the discrimination that we Albanians faced in each and every segment of the social and political life. While I completed my elementary education with excellent results, I was not admitted to high school, and for a year I had to tend to our sheep. My father insisted that I resume my education the following year, 1966, when it was easier to be admitted to school after Alexander Rankovic's fall. Following my pedagogical studies, I read history at the University of Pristina. After completing my studies, I first worked as a teacher in my village and later as a high school teacher at the Drenas and Skanderia Gymnasium. However, I knew that the whole knowledge in the world wouldn't be enough to change the situation for the Albanians in Yugoslavia without a proper and general volunteer organization of my generation. Therefore, I joined the clandestine organization called the Kosovo Revolutionary Group, whose main purpose was the liberation of Kosovo and its unification with Albania. And this happened in 1973. In 1981, incited by their massive dissatisfaction, the youth of Kosovo organized protests which came to be known as the 1981 Albanian Spring. This was a general mobilization of people in Kosovo to seek equal rights with other nations comprising the Yugoslav Federation. Those protests were suppressed with violence by the military and police forces. According to their own official channels, in the protests, 11 youngsters were killed, 285 were wounded, and hundreds and thousands were imprisoned. Thousands of political prisoners were subjected to physical and psychological violence. I too was subjected to terrible violence. During investigations against me in 1981 and 1982, I had to endure indescribable acts. My hands and legs were always swollen due to the beatings. And after both investigations, I was sentenced twice. The first time in 1981, I was sentenced to 14 years in prison, and the second time, in 1982, I was sentenced to 15 years in prison. I refer to those tortures to underline an important fact. None of the investigators, prosecutors, and judges in former Yugoslavia who were responsible for the physical and mental tortures against me at the time was ever criticized in my writings. I left it to their conscience to instill some sense of guilt in them for their criminal acts. I do not understand the logic of the current charges against me. Systematic violence, murders, imprisonment, tortures, and punishments were exercised against our people. I hate violence, murders, imprisonment, tortures, punishments, not only because they were exercised against my people and against me personally, but because I consider them to be bad and inhumane. Those who speak the truth will say that I, Jakub Kresnici, was never involved in any murder, any imprisonment, or any form of pressure against anyone. My intellectual and human integrity made it clear to me which tools should be used to achieve the national liberation in the war against those who designed and implemented genocide against us. After doing 10 years in prison, I was released from the prison of Novi Sad on the 23rd of July 1991. That did not mean, however, that I was free. Albanians in Kosovo were the most oppressed people in Europe. They were the forbidden people, as described by Recep Ćosja, the great Albanian intellectual and academic. So, from the prison building of Novi Sad, which was full of Albanians, I came into a prison with 2 million Albanians, which was called Kosovo. I entered the Kosovo prison at a time when Slobodan Milosevic's regime started to implement its apartheid policy as the preface of planned genocide against the Albanians. Immediately after returning to Kosovo, I joined the Democratic League of Kosovo structures in Drenas. At the time, the LDK was involved in organizing a functioning parallel system of political and institutional life in Kosovo to ease the consequences of the apartheid policy that had been installed by the Belgrade regime. In the context of establishing central institutions, Kosovo parliamentary elections were conducted in 1992. In the elections, I won 96% of the votes in my constituency, and I became a member of the assembly. In the following years, as an LDK member, I led the Financial Council in Drenas, and from April 1996 till the beginning of the armed war in 1998, I chaired the Education Council in Drenas. I was also the leader of the LDK branch in Drenas from late 1997 till April 1998. In that position, I was constantly in touch with LDK leadership structures in Pristina. It is absurd to accuse me of persecuting LDK members or of being part of a common criminal purpose to attack LDK. I was an LDK member myself. My family members were LDK members. My comrades and soldiers were LDK members. Only a deranged mind could have the idea that I might have partaken in the persecution of my family members, my comrades, and my co-fighters. Your Honors, my whole life I've lived in tolerance toward differing opinions. I'd like to bring up an example that shows the untruth of the allegations made in the indictment. Like many other family members, my brother, Agim Krasniqi, was an LDK member before the war, during the war, and after the war. In the free elections after the war, his daughter and my niece, Mimoza Krasniqi, was elected to the municipal council as Drenas as an LDK member. Although after the war we worked under separate political parties, I relished the memory of and had respect for the activists of the LDK, with whom we acted in very difficult circumstances. The attempts to find a peaceful solution to the Kosovo issue failed because of the Belgrade regime, which had designed a genocidal policy. Therefore, it didn't express the slightest interest in avoiding an armed conflict. When the war began, instead of engaging with the Kosovo Liberation Army, the armed forces of what remained from the Yugoslav Federation, under the Milosevic's regime full control, undertook offensives against Albanian settlements, massacring children, women, and old people, and destroying schools, cultural centers, libraries, religious buildings, and everything that was connected with the Albanian identity. As the LDK chairman in Drenas, I witnessed the crimes in Likoshan, Chires, and Prekaz, and many other terrible crimes that took place, which were pure acts of genocide. On those difficult days, I visited those families after the murders of their family members. In the funeral in Likoshan, I made a speech on behalf of the LDK and all local political parties. I saw with my own eyes that in the settlements targeted by the enemy, most of the family members had been executed, such as Ahmet Ahmeti, Gani Ahmeti, Hilmi Ahmeti, Hamza Mehmeti, Driton Ahmeti, Naim Ahmeti, Lumni Ahmeti, Shamsi Ahmeti, Basri Ahmeti, Elhami Ahmeti. All these are members of a family. Ilir Nebiu, Rukiye Nebiu, Jemshir Nebiu, Bekir Seydiu, Nazmi Seydiu, Bedri Seydiu, Bekim Seydiu. In Prekaz, in addition to the 59 people that were executed, I'll only read the names of the children. Blerina Yashari, 7 years old.
Non vjeçare.
Fatima Yashari, 9 years old. Iqbal Yashari, 11 years old. Abdullah Yashari, 16 years old. Berim Yashari, 12 years old. Iqbal Buyar Yashari, 5 years old. Iqbal Yashari, 13 years old. Ushtrim Yashari, 13 years old.
Shari 15
Liria Yashari, 15 years old. Valdita Yashari, 15 years old. But a total of 59 members of the Yashari family in Prekaz. I'm not ashamed to publicly admit having shed tears when I saw in a construction material storage facility at the entrance of Skandere all those murdered people of the Ashari family in Prekaz. Adem Demaci, who had been a political prisoner for approximately 30 years and who won the Sakharov Prize, noticed that I was crying. And after expressing his condolences, he told me, Yakub, there is no victory without war and sacrifices. I knew that it was the price of freedom. I tried to hold back my tears, but I couldn't. I wasn't crying for Adem, Hams, and Shaban Yashari, who have become a legend of freedom. I was crying for the children, for the heirs of my nation, for those who didn't have the chance to live their childhood. In those moments, it became clear to me that I couldn't hide from the truth with my head in the sand like an ostrich. It was clear that Serbia had started the implementation of their genocide plan. It was not humane to turn my back to those facing the consequences of genocide. That was a decisive moment. And at that moment, I said, freedom or death, and no more under the rule of genocide policy of Serbia. At that time, exactly in June 1998, I was offered the proposal to go out publicly as the KLA spokesperson. I did not hesitate a moment to take on the duty, even though it entailed great danger. I was totally aware that my public appearance, my identity as the spokesperson of the Kosovo Liberation Army would put my family at risk too. My public appearance made my family a target. But then any Albanian family in Kosovo was a target. That's why today I won't speak about the fate of my family. I will not speak about my father who died because of the Serbs' tortures, because all Albanians, no matter their political, religious, gender, or age, were targeted under the Serb genocide plan. As an illustration, I'll mention that in pursuing their aim to destroy Albanians, the Serb forces killed 1,392 children, including babies, 1,739 women, and over 10,000 other civilians. Despite all the flaws and challenges accompanying us during the war, in my role as the KLA spokesman, I tried to give the impression that we were an organized structure, because this was the only way to keep alive the hopes for proper resistance. Therefore, my statements should be read in the context of the propaganda striving to affirm our liberation war. Beyond the aspirations for national unification pursued by us, statements of such nature during the war were intended to keep alive the hope that unification with Albania would increase chances of victory. Today I won't dwell too long on our liberation war, nor on my diplomatic contacts as a political representative of the KLA, nor on the Rambouillet conference, the output of which we signed in order to give peace a chance, even though the agreement was not a good one for us. Whenever we could, we opened all our doors to peace. We were guided by Skanderbeg's message, who said, "Seeking war is madness, but responding to it when it is imposed on you is wisdom." Nor will I outline my political journey after the liberation of the country, the establishment of the UNMIK administration, the negotiation for the final status of Kosovo in Vienna, led by President Marti Ahtisaari, and my engagement in the building of the Republic of Kosovo as a democratic state fully observing the minorities' rights and freedoms. There is no reason to do so, as my whole activity was public and is a known fact. All those who dealt with Kosovo issue, both locals and internationals, know my role and my contribution in those processes. If there is something in my political journey that doesn't make sense, is the indictment submitted by the SPO. The content of the indictment has hurt me more than the terrible tortures and imprisonment by the Yugoslav and Serbian regime. The pretext for this indictment was found in Carla Del Ponte's book and Dick Marty's so-called report on the organ trafficking by the KLA. After much investigation conducted for several years by the ULEX SITF led by Clint Williamson, a team of investigators from 18 countries in the EU, Canada, and the USA didn't find a shred of evidence. Thus, an allegation was not included in the SPO indictment. In conclusion, by way of illustration, I'd like to refer to a media-covered case of killing Serbian civilians in Kosovo. On the 14th of December 1998, 42 KLA soldiers were killed near the border with Albania. In the evening on the same day, at the Panda Cafe in the city of Peja, 6 Serbian and Montenegrin youngsters were killed. The murder of those youngsters was interpreted as an act of vengeance by the KLA. During the attempts to find the culprits, hundreds of innocent Albanians were tortured until 6 youngsters were forced to confess to a crime they hadn't committed. The truth for that terrible act came out 15 years later. Vuk Drašković, who, during the war in Kosovo, was the Deputy Prime Minister of Yugoslavia, in an interview published in the Belgradian newspaper Kurir on the 18th of January 2014, titled "Milosevic ordered Radetan and Legian to kill Serbian children," stated, and I'm quoting, "The decision for the series of crimes against the Serbs in Kosovo and the Albanians that supported Serbia, with a view to lending the blame to the KLA, was made by Milosevic and his strategic staff. The decision had been made for the state security services to commit several terrorist attacks for which the KLA would be blamed." This article, I'm repeating, was titled "Milosevic ordered Radetan and Legian to kill Serbian children."
Të nderuar gjyqtar, jam
I'm concluding. Your Honors, the evidence given by a person holding a senior government position at the time when a genocide policy was being pursued against the Albanians should make everyone aware of the fact that the Belgrade regime was behind the killings of civilians of all ethnicities in Kosovo. I was never at the service of any criminal policy. This is why I have a clear conscience. I have lived a life with dignity, and I want to die with dignity. In my life, I never committed any criminal acts, either before the war, or during the war, or even after the war. I have never been involved in any criminal acts, be it in the form of action or omission or in any other form. I've always acted for the freedom and national unification which have been the goals of my life. That is why I've always been proud of my political activity. Both in the past and today, I can hold my head high, and I'm happy that I've managed, even in very challenging circumstances, to keep my human and intellectual integrity. That is why I have a clear conscience. Your honors, your honors. I have 3 pleadings for the honors. The first one, don't allow the misuse of individual opinions and views expressed after the war on the time of war. The second request, don't allow for my notes and notes that I wrote on my books and essays be used as evidence for a criminal act, as the SPO intends to do. And thirdly, on the communiques, I will read on what was stated in the Fatmir Limai's judgment, where the communiques were used as a propaganda in order to increase respect and morale for the KLA and its authorities, so that the people could believe in it, have trust in it, and join it. Paragraph 118 of the judgment of the ICTY on Limai, and the same thing was stated in the acquittal judgment on Ramush Haradinaj. I kindly ask you not to allow for materials to be misused, such as the notes that I had written down for writing a book that misused by the SPO. They took many materials, even the letters I wrote from the prison, but that's not evidence. Thank you for your attention, and I apologize for taking this long, but the indictment is even longer, so this is short what I said compared to my what I can say about my life.
Ms. Alejandra, your client has used up some of your time, so please be short.
I'll be very short, Your Honor. We are well within the 1.5 hours indicated. Your Honor, this is the man that the prosecution say intended to kill, torture, or cruelly treat innocent civilians. In these proceedings, you will see who Jakub Krasniqi really is. He's an educated man, raised with values, who always acts with dignity. He is very human. After all that he endured, he is not a man to stand idly by when people are tortured or civilians are beaten. Jakub Krasniqi was not personally responsible for committing any of the offenses with which he is charged. He was not a party to any joint criminal enterprise, as alleged by the prosecution. There was no agreement to commit crimes. His goal was to ensure the development of a free and safe nation for Kosovo Albanians, independent from the Serbian state. Around 25 years after the start of the armed conflict, after years of investigations, after all the efforts of the Dick Marty report, after all the efforts of the ICTY, and after all the efforts of ULEX, at the opening of this trial, there remains one irrefutable fact. Not one credible witness, not one man, woman, or child, not one international can say that Jakub Krasniqi was present and participated in the interrogation, torture, mistreatment, or killing of any civilian. Not in his name, not in his presence. That is the prosecution evidence, Your Honor. That is not who Jakub Krasniqi is. And it is why, at the end of this case, we are confident that there will be only one outcome. He will be acquitted. Thank you, Your Honors.
Thank you, Ms. Allegendra. This concludes the opening statements of the parties and participants. We will resume on Tuesday, 11 April 2023 at 9 o'clock to begin the presentation of evidence in the SPO's case. The panel would also like to remind the parties and participants that pursuant to paragraph 78 of the Order on the Conduct of Proceedings, the calling party shall upload to Legal Workflow its final presentation queue that includes all documents it intends to use with the witness. That should be no later than 24 hours before a witness is due to testify. For clarity, the panel notes that this 24-hour deadline applies even if it falls on a non-work day or holiday. The presentation queue with regard to the first witness shall therefore be uploaded in Legal Workflow no later than Monday, 10 April 2023 at 9 a.m. This concludes today's public hearing. I thank the parties, the participants, and the registry for their attendance. I also wish to thank the interpreters, stenographers, audiovisual technicians, and security personnel for their assistance. Mr. Keogh.
Yes, Your Honor, just briefly. I do believe there has been a change of the lineup of the witnesses. If we could have some clarity from the SPO that they moved out their third witness and are moving the others up, if I understand that correctly.
It's news to me. Is there some change?
Your Honor, we have sent an email, indeed, to the defense, I believe some days ago, also to the court officers for your attention. So I'd hope this was brought to your attention, but if not, we will look into that. It's not a definitive change of the order. We have noted that if the examinations and cross-examinations follow the time estimates, we would have one witness that would have a 2-week break within the testimony, and that may be a reason to move that witness to the beginning of the May days rather than start in April. And we will use the time efficiently by examining the next witness in line in that time.
Is this all in the email that you
It's
sent?
all in the email.
All right. Well, that seems to be answered.
If I may, Judge, that is in fact the problem. The third witness is an extensive witness, and which brings with it a tremendous amount of information and a tremendous amount of work. So what I was asking for, given where we are with these timeframes, are we removing number 3 and moving them down the list? If we are, that's fine, but with all due respect, Your Honor, I would ask that the prosecution commit to that now or not.
Thank you.
Your Honor, if I may just say, I think we have a bit more of a fundamental problem here, which is that we, at this stage, not even have all cross-examination estimates. We thought we did. Your Honors, you did clearly, as you have indicated in your decision F01336. However, on the 20th of March, the Salimi defense, and this is page 2055 of the transcript, set out that they had provided 5 estimates so far, and they were still working on providing the estimates from the other witnesses. And I think in general, we are putting the cart behind the horse here. We need clear cross-examination estimates, and then we can schedule the witnesses. Obviously, we cannot fully commit to how it will play out because we will have to see how much time we are actually using. But at this stage, the time estimates provided will ensure that there will be a 2-week break in the examination of this particular witness, which is something we can avoid and that we will avoid.
And when will you know for sure?
That will depend on how much time we're actually using on the first and second witness, Your Honor. So that is why we have given notice in advance that it may be necessary to move the third witness depending on how much time we're actually using. But again, we have had a clear order for coordinated cross-examination estimates by February 13. And we have heard on the 20th of March that these are still not here. So this process would all be more efficient if the defense teams would provide these estimates well in advance. Thank
All
you.
right.
Your Honor, that's unworkable, because what we have now is, if in fact we have some efficiencies as we move through this, which hopefully we will, and we start to get our sea legs in this trial, Judge, then the SPO is going to decide on the fly if number 3 comes in or number 3 goes back to May. And what I submit to the court as an officer of the court is that number 3 requires quite a bit of work. Now, if number 3 is off, then we'll move back to 4 and 5. But to just operate on the fly, that we're just going to decide how things go if 3 goes in or doesn't go in, doesn't allow us to plan the way we need to plan.
All right, we'll step aside for about 5 minutes. Everyone stay where you are, and we'll make a decision and make a ruling. I don't need any further information.
All rise. All rise.
Be seated. We've taken into consideration the request and the response, and it is the decision of the panel that there will be no change in the scheduled witnesses as previously stated. At this time, we will consider requests for such a change when such a definite need arises. Number two, all defense teams are to provide no later than close of business today a complete estimate of cross-examination on the first 12 witnesses. Three, updates by the SPO for all of us, parties, participants, and the panel, is to be given no later than the end of the first witnesses, or the first witness's testimony at the latest. That concludes this hearing. Thank you very much.
All rise.